Nate Fick is the CEO of Endgame, a venture-backed security software company. Prior to joining Endgame, he was CEO of the Center for a New American Security, a national security research organization. Additionally, he served as a Marine Corps infantry and reconnaissance officer and completed combat tours in Afghanistan and Iraq. He wrote about his military experience in a New York Times best-selling book, One Bullet Away. Here's somebody who has very thoughtful perspective on the future of war. He'll be interviewed tonight by an incredible moderator by the name of Nicole Perlroth. Nicole is the New York Times cybersecurity and privacy reporter. She joined the Times in 2011 after a career covering venture capital and startups for Forbes magazine. She's currently working on a cybersecurity book titled, "This is How They Tell Me the World Ends." This is great. I'm looking forward to the program. I know you'll enjoy both Nate and Nicole. Let's bring them up.
All right, well, thanks for having us. Thanks for coming. It's an honor to be here with Nate, who I think I met in my capacity as a Forbes reporter. I was on a project and we were looking for classics majors. I don't even remember the context of the project. We were looking for people who were in the public sphere who had studied the classics. And somehow we dug up Nate here, who was a classics major at Dartmouth. And that was the first interview I did with Nate, was on your thoughts on sort of power, ambition, and glory in the context of the classics. And I think that was almost 10 years ago. So now here we are. We're both in the cybersecurity world. We're here at the Computer History Museum, so I thought I would walk us back just a little bit. 40 years ago, I drove by Rosati's on the way here, the Alpine Inn in Portola Valley, where they sent one of the first email messages over what was then ARPANET. And at the time, this precursor to the internet was designed for openness. It was designed to accept messages. It was never designed to be a platform of war, which is what it has become. So I took the cybersecurity beat at the New York Times 6-7 years ago, and just in those 7 years, it's amazing what has happened. It's almost easy to forget, but we saw one of the first acts of cyber war with a U.S.-Israeli joint program that used a cyber weapon to dismantle centrifuges at an Iranian nuclear facility. We saw Iranian hackers use a digital weapon to wipe out data at Saudi Aramco, the world's biggest oil company. We saw North Korea use a very similar tool to wipe out computers at Sony over a James Franco, Seth Rogen film. We have now seen something even, this is accelerated at a pace that I don't think even the best cyber warriors in this country expected, which is just in the last year, we've now seen some of the most coveted cyber weapons developed at the NSA dumped online and picked up by actors like North Korea and used against to hold hostage computer systems at British hospitals, at Rosneft, the Russian oil and gas company, at FedEx. We saw Russian hackers use the NSA's tools to attack a Ukrainian payroll company in an attack that paralyzed production facilities in Tasmania. So this is the brave new world we are living in right now, and it seems like with every attack, they just get bolder, they just get more destructive. And there's just a lot to unpack there. So I thought we would just start there with what I call sort of the highlights of the last couple of years and ask Nate, what your thoughts are on how did we get here? How did we get to this point where things have accelerated to a degree where we see the collateral damage from some of these cyber weapons hitting every day now, and companies are in a place where they're being asked to defend themselves against nation states.
That's probably the best succinct overview of the dawn of the modern era of cyber warfare that you're going to hear. So I hope everybody caught that. It's a real honor to be here at this great institution in the heart of Silicon Valley, which is a perfect place to have this discussion, and really fun for me to share the stage with Nicole, who's a true expert on this topic. So I think to answer that question of how did we get here, I would start with some of the macro secular trends, some of the underlying trends that have helped set the table, if you will. And can you hear me? Is this okay? Yeah. First is the increase in our individual and collective dependence on the digital world. We're connecting something like 1 billion devices a quarter to the internet and globally, and that's a trend that's not going to change. I'm on a university board, and in the 5 years I've been on the board, we've tracked the number of incoming freshmen with internet-connected devices. And the number on average has gone from 4 to 11 in that 5-year period. Every business now, because of mobility, because of infrastructure as a service, business process outsourcing of different kinds, every company is a tech company. So that's trend number one, is more and more of our stuff is connected to the internet. Trend number two is the barriers to entry to high-end cyber capability are falling. And some of that is advances in computing, but some of it is because these nation-state capabilities are getting dumped in the wild. And so that leads to this asymmetry that Nicole mentioned, where you used to have a line between companies competing with companies and states attacking or threatening states. And that line existed for most of history, if you're talking about warfare. That line has basically been erased. And I think it's been rubbed out slowly over time. But a real watershed moment in my mind was the Iranian retaliation for that Stuxnet attack, the joint Israeli-American operation to destroy the centrifuges. In response to that attack, Iranian state-linked actors launched a DDoS attack on American banks, or a series of them. And that was a distributed denial of service attack against American banks. And that, I think, was a real Rubicon kind of moment, where all of a sudden the old playbook went out the window, and we were living in a world where companies had to defend themselves against the resources of states. So, I think that's kind of how we got here. But we continue to do a bunch of things, in my view, that make it likely that this gets worse before it gets better.
The Iranian DDoS attacks is indeed a Rubicon event. And what was interesting about that was that DDoS attack is just a denial of service attack. They were hitting US online banking systems with vast volumes of traffic, so it was making it harder for you and I to get to our banking site, or the sites had collapsed. And it wasn't a sophisticated attack. It was sophisticated in some sense in that they were able to get more power behind these fire hoses that they were sending to the online banking sites. But I think it showed Iran that what they could do with a pretty basic attack. I mean, we at the New York Times, I spent my Christmas covering those attacks. It was making headlines every day. And I think that they learned a real lesson, which is a lot can be done even with sort of the bare bones type of cyber attacks. So that's very interesting. And I think we've gotten to a point where Sony, same thing. They didn't do anything particularly sophisticated, but they managed to wipe out tens of thousands of servers at Sony. Has this come up? I think in the past we assumed if we're just the best and the brightest at pulling off sophisticated cyber attacks, this would be a deterrent to some of these other actors. But in fact, they've learned they can come back and do quite a bit with some of these more bare bones tactics.
And that should not have come as a surprise to anyone in the national security establishment. Go back to David and Goliath. One of the great books about Vietnam is called The War of the Flea, about the asymmetry that an insurgent force can bring to bear using relatively simple weapons and relatively little money to cripple a very sophisticated, very well-trained, very well-armed, very well-funded army. I mean, as a veteran of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, I kind of witnessed this one firsthand, where all the training and all the weapons in the world can be brought to a screeching halt on a highway by a $25 bomb in the road, right? And that's kind of what's happening here, where a lot of the same asymmetries apply that apply to insurgent warfare or to terrorism and counterterrorism. The idea that the defender has to be right always and the attacker only has to be right once. The idea that attribution is hard, and where attribution is difficult, deterrence is imperfect, right? Because you don't know who to hit back against. There are a bunch of parallels here, and thinking that we can somehow take refuge in being the most sophisticated, it's an illusion. And in fact, being the most sophisticated actually makes us also the most vulnerable, right? They're two sides of the same coin.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people forget that. We might be very sophisticated at offense, and we might be, we could pull off the most sophisticated cyber attack on an Iranian centrifuge facility that another actor like North Korea or Iran might not be able to do. But at the same time, we're the most digitally connected country out there, and as Nate pointed out, we're only getting more connected. And so I think people don't realize that actually we're also the most vulnerable country out there. And one of the investigations we just did at the Times was about North Korea. So let's talk a little bit about North Korea. One thing is, I think this is a country that's learned they have nothing left to lose, which gives them a certain amount of runway in cyberspace. They really seem to be pushing this envelope with the amount of attacks that they can pull off. This ransomware attack that held British hospitals was just one example, but they faced pretty little retribution for some of their actions. And where does deterrence theory apply when it comes to an actor like North Korea?
Yeah, North Korea is a really interesting case, right? Because you say, well, we're going to expel you from this or that international body. Nope, that already happened. We're going to ratchet up sanctions. Nope, that's already done. We're going to deprive you of the means to interact with the world with information and nope, that's already done. I mean, you're right. It's sort of like, where do you have left to go? And I think it's interesting that generally speaking, and I'll circle back to North Korea here, but generally speaking, in the course of our work, my work today, what we see is that countries' behavior in the cyber domain more or less tracks their behavior in other aspects of international affairs. It's a tool of international power, and it's not something that tends to, it's not like they're behaving in one way over here and then off the reservation, with the cyber stuff. They tend to be pretty congruent. So the Russians are basically on the march and very aggressive. The Chinese are in some cases being assertive, but also somewhat measured, because there's a sense that they want to be a global player on the international stage and they have something to lose. The Iranians, I would say Iranian cyber activity really tailed off in the wake of the nuclear deal, because all of a sudden they really had something to lose. And the North Koreans are just this, I don't want to say irrational, because that is it's belittling in a way that I don't mean it to be belittling, but rogue, unpredictable. If there is a rationale there, it's not one that's easy for us to see and game out. So the North Koreans are a great example, I guess, of a deterrence failure. And partly it's because we've already used a lot of the tools that we would ordinarily use, and part of it's because deterrence American deterrence today stops at the keyboard. We can say more about that if you want to.
Yeah, I mean,
I don't want to go running down a tangent.
No,
but
I mean, so you have said that the U.S. government's deterrence strategy is not working. And what do you mean by that? What have we tried, and why isn't it working?
So I guess my 10-second history of the 20th century and the early 21st century is that since 1945, the end of World War II, American power has basically kept the lid on great power conflict in Europe and Asia. There have been plenty of wars and a lot of stupid foreign policy, but there haven't been great power wars since 1945. And that has been, to some extent, because of the extension of a deterrent umbrella through American allies in NATO and Japan and South Korea, primarily. And that 70 years has seen the growth of a ton of military power, diplomatic power, informational power, economic power, and that power has been used. It primarily hasn't been used. It's been threatened, right? And the act of threatening it has enforced a set of norms of behavior. And when the norms have been violated, force has been used, or sanctions have been applied, or whatever. All of that power, it seems to me, that work pretty well in the kinetic world or the real world, it's not extending into the cyber domain. Take the Russians as an example, and let's look at the last election. And let's not look at it as a political issue. Let's look at it as a national security issue. And think about if a foreign power had used kinetic means to disrupt or undermine or interfere with our electoral process. Imagine if agents on the ground or a missile strike or some other kinetic means had been used at a polling site or the headquarters of one of our political parties. We know what that response would look like, right? There's a declaratory policy in place, a set of red lines. If you cross the red line, we're going to do X. And there's an escalatory policy in place. Once you cross the line, then we go up that ladder from fist to stick to knife to gun. And that doesn't exist in the cyber world. And so our adversaries do things to us in the cyber domain that they would never do in the kinetic world because they know they can get away with it. Whether it's Russian interference in an election or the Chinese stripping of defense-related IP or count your many other examples.
So let's talk about something that's just adds a huge layer of complexity to this, which you've already mentioned, which is attribution. Here in the United States, if we pull off an act of cyber war, you can pretty much be sure that it was done by Cyber Command. In the case of some of our adversaries, you can't really be sure where these attacks are coming from. In Russia, it's well known that they rely on proxies to conduct a lot of their attacks. In China, they rely, in many cases, on contractors for some of the most sophisticated cyber attacks we've seen. The attack at Google was the work of Chinese contractors. The attack on the RSA security firm was the work of Chinese contractors. The attack at the Office of Personnel Management, which breached personal information for thousands of people that have security clearances, including their fingerprints, was done by Chinese contractors. So we're dealing with a situation where you're not just talking about international bodies working against each other, you're talking about transnational entities, and we can't even be quite sure who to retaliate against. If we get hit by an attack by North Korea and it turns out the hackers were based in India or in China, who do we retaliate back to? Mm-hmm. Have you thought about any of these?
Yeah, so there too, there are interesting historical analogs. And I like the saying that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And so I think there are things we can learn having dealt with similar problems in the past. And I'll point to terrorism as one. So after the 9/11 attacks, one of the things the Bush administration got right, in my view, one of relatively few things at that point in history, one of the things they got right was was trying to make the asymmetry symmetrical. And the way they did that was in saying that the United States will enforce its interests against terrorist groups or states that harbor them. And so that was a recognition that these non-state actors are often operating within the boundaries of a state, but maybe without the full sanction of that state, sort of a sin of omission, not commission. And I think there's an analog here. I don't think it's no coincidence that these kinds of attacks emanate generally from places where they're either linked to the host government or they're in a place where the rule of law is weak, right? And they can get away with it. And so I think it would be imperfect, but we could somewhat square that asymmetry by a similar kind of linkage and saying, we will retaliate against nefarious cyber actors and against the states that harbor them. You know, these are human beings that are working in a place and using infrastructure in a place. And it wouldn't be perfect. And there are two kinds of attribution, too. There's technical attribution, but there's also intentional attribution. And so that makes it hard as well. But I think if we were more full-throated in linking the cyber activity to the state that was either encouraging it or benignly allowing it, we could begin to deal with the asymmetry.
Right. So when Putin says that hackers are like artists and they just wake up and they do what they're going to do, we will hold him accountable for what those artists do.
Yes.
Okay. One of the other complexities in this space that I think is pretty interesting is that, you know, with a nuclear weapon, you need the fissile material to work. With cyber weapons, you just need code and you need vulnerabilities that you can access other systems with. And one thing that has been very interesting is that in cyber war, enemies can learn from each other. So when we, or the US and Israel, attack an Iranian nuclear facility, that code gets out there, and it basically did get out there, and anyone with any interest could dissect it, reverse engineer it, and retrofit it potentially for their own purposes, which I think creates sort of a challenge for the US intelligence agencies and at Cyber Command to decide when to use some of these weapons, and I don't think people quite realize that there is this possibility that they might end up in our own backyard too. What are your thoughts on, you know, under what circumstances should we be using some of these tools? And do you think that in speaking with some of the federal agencies, they've thought out this idea of collateral damage or this boomerang effect?
It's a great question. I was struggling to try to find like an analogy to describe what it's like when you fire these cyber weapons downrange. And I think boomerang's exactly it. Imagine if we stood up here and we threw 1,000 boomerangs out into the air and they all had razor blade edges and they're all spinning out there, but you know they're all coming back, right? And do it in the dark so you can't see them coming back, right? And if that were the case, if we were standing on the stage in the dark throwing razor-tipped boomerangs out into the dark, how bad would the threat have to be before we were willing to throw one? Right? I mean, I kind of feel like that starts to make it visceral. And that said, there are plenty of times when they should be used. And you know, the simple reason in my mind why they should be used is they're a whole heck of a lot better than dropping real bombs. If the Stuxnet attack on the Iranian nuclear program, if it managed to delay a war, if it kept Israeli F-15s on the ground for another 3 years or another 5 years or another 7 years, in my mind, that's well worth it. And so these aren't choices between good and bad. They're choices between bad and worse. And the rules governing their use, in my view, are the same rules governing any other use of force. So let's go back to the classics. And think about St. Augustine. I mean, start there. The laws of war originated 1,500 years ago in this body of thought. And two of the big tenets are proportionality. That is, if a child throws a rock at me, I can't, mow down a family, right? I mean, there's a doctrine of proportional response and a doctrine of non-combatant immunity, right? Which is combatants are legitimate targets and civilians are not. That's relatively straightforward in a 1991 Gulf War kind of world where you have uniformed militaries and tanks. It gets a whole lot harder in the kind of wars that I fought in, where your adversary isn't wearing a uniform and is hiding among the people. And it's really hard in the cyber domain, right, where a legitimate target might be an electric grid, say. That's a national infrastructure target in a military campaign would generally be recognized as a legitimate target. Bombing an electrical substation is different from bombing a hospital. But the impact of bombing that substation or launching a cyber attack on that substation can be very, it can be widespread and it can be very uneven, right, in its kind of reach. So I don't have the answer, but I would say the same rules need to apply. Mm-hmm. We need to use force in the cyber domain in accordance with the same laws of warfare that govern our conduct in other domains.
Mm-hmm. It is interesting just looking back at some of the events I mentioned when we first sat down. When North Korea hit Sony, if you remember, Obama went on TV and he said, we will respond proportionally at a date and time of our choosing. And apparently we did respond. That response is classified. I wish I knew what it was and I could tell you what it was, but I don't know.
I think we took down all 11 sites on the North Korean internet for like 3 days.
I think the idea of, how to, exactly. I think that in some cases, the idea of responding proportionally with a cyber tool is just practically doesn't quite work. And with Russia, with the elections, I mean, what does a proportional response entail?
Great. So this is a really important point, I think, in talking about deterrence in the cyber world. We must not think of a cyber response to a cyber act. The whole point is to decouple the two and think about other responses to a cyber act, because you're exactly right. We can't deter the North Koreans using cyber means. There's nothing to hit back at. I remember in Afghanistan in the fall of 2001, after the first few nights of the air campaign, all of a sudden, things tapered off because there were no more targets, right? And in a cyber campaign against an adversary like the North Koreans, you're going to arguably run out of targets pretty quickly. So you got to decouple those two things and think about using non-cyber means to respond to a cyber attack. And I'm not advocating, look, it's a delicate argument to make, right? Because you have to first believe that having the force and having the doctrine and being public about it is going to have deterrent value. I'm not talking about launching Tomahawk missiles at everybody who, attacks the US using cyber means. But I think we're locked in a losing game right now, where $1 of offense beats $1 of defense every single time. And it's not machine on machine, it's person on person. Offense is dominant, and we're losing every single day. And the drumbeat of losses is getting louder, and the attacks are getting more crippling, and they're getting more frequent. And we need to wake up, and we need to change the game, because we're locked in a losing game. Mm-hmm. And OPM stripped the personal information of basically every American with a security clearance right out of our government. Equifax did the same for effectively every adult in the United States. When does it stop? And when are we going to say enough is enough and we need to change the game? And we cannot keep building 12-foot walls for our attacker to build a 14-foot ladder. We're locked in this escalation that isn't actually generating for us any more security. And so that's why I think the only answer here is to bring to bear the power of the government. At the end of the day, governments exist primarily to provide security for people, whether it's a local police force or a national military. And I think our government is failing to secure the cyber domain on which we are all increasingly reliant for commerce and communication and everything else. And unless and until the government extends deterrence into the cyber world in some way to keep the peace, I think the Wild West is going to prevail.
So let's talk about that, because I agree with you. I agree with everything you just said. The story that always comes to mind when I think about, at what level can we really defend ourselves with, and to what extent without some sort of Geneva Convention for cybersecurity. The story that always comes to mind was a U.S. critical infrastructure company that I wrote about for the New York Times. It was an energy firm, and they had some of the most sophisticated cyber defenses in place. I mean, they probably had a bigger budget for cyber defense than some of the banks. And they were hit by a Chinese cyber attack, and the Chinese attack was not successful. They couldn't get away into this energy firm. So what did they do? They looked on social media. They found out where some of the engineers at this energy firm liked to order, or restaurants they had liked on social media. They found this one Chinese takeout place that was close to the headquarters, and they implanted malware in the PDF takeout menu of this place, just down the street from this energy firm that had some of the tallest walls and the biggest cybersecurity defense budgets in the country, and that's how they got in. And that just, to me, sticks with me as an example of, you could spend as much money as you want trying to keep these guys out, and they're going to get in through the Chinese takeout menu. So until we have some sort of rules for engagement and what is acceptable and unacceptable behavior, those attacks will continue. I think you mentioned earlier, we have had some success with the Obama-Xi agreement about there being sort of limits to what kind of attacks can be used for industrial espionage. And in fact, I think we have seen a dip off in Chinese IP theft attacks after that agreement, which is a sort of ray of sunshine in these discussions. When we talk about doing some sort of international Geneva-type convention for cybersecurity, where do you come down? Because a lot of people in the industry are pretty skeptical that anything like that could happen, and they think that any attempt to sort of regulate this space will backfire.
Well, pragmatically, I think we can probably table that one for another 3 to 7 years. But I don't think there's a lot of appetite in the U.S. government right now for entering into new multilateral agreements. But as a general rule of thumb, I think that you often find people with defense or military backgrounds are in some ways our staunchest diplomats. And I'm a firm believer in talking, even if it's messy and painful and slow and seems ineffectual. We should talk and talk and talk and talk and talk and talk until we're blue in the face, and talk until we've exhausted every alternative. And we haven't even begun to talk on this issue in any meaningful way. So I think there's a lot that we ought to explore. In fact, we must explore that just hasn't happened yet. And it's fascinating, especially in this place, the Computer History Museum. What better place to talk about the differing speeds at which these conversations happen? I always think of the cyber domain as being characterized by 4 vectors. And they're all moving in the same direction, but they're moving at very different speeds. You have the tech vector that's moving, at the speed of light, right? Really, really fast. And just behind it is the second vector, which is social norms. And anybody with young kids knows that the norms are evolving right on the heels of the tech. And then there's a huge gap back to law and policy. And so all the interesting stuff is happening in that gap. It's all the stuff that's technically feasible and has some level of social acceptance, but law and policy haven't caught up yet. That's where the conversation's happening. And so how can we find a way to, we're not going to slow the tech down, and we don't want to, but how can we get policy and law to move faster and close the gap, shrink the gap?
That reminds me of another ray of sunshine in this discussion, which is, when Facebook was going public, its motto was move fast and break things. And when I went to go visit Facebook headquarters last, the motto had changed, and it was, I see my nephew's in the audience, so to use a different word here, but it was no longer move fast and break things. It said move slow and fix your SHIT. And I thought that was okay. There's some good news here. The fact that we've had these very high-profile attacks and breaches and attacks on social media against dissidents and human rights activists and journalists has really caught up to executives at these companies, that they realize that they need to invest in security and that they're up against some pretty sophisticated actors. So that actually brings me to my next question, which is, when you're talking to businesses, how has their sort of awareness of this issue changed over the last 6 years? What do they think about the fact that they are now targets for nation-state attacks? What do they feel hopeless? Do they feel like there's nothing they can do to defend themselves against these attacks? Do they want to hack back against these people? What's sort of the general conversation looking like these days?
Yeah, let's talk about the hacking back for a minute, since you raised it, and then I'd love to talk about the general tone in businesses that at least that I see and hear. David Cowan is here, one of the great security investors in the United States, and David had the best response that I've seen on hacking back. David said that allowing companies to hack back would be like sending citizens with pitchforks to Afghanistan after 9/11. And we ought to want to live in a society where the government has a monopoly on the legitimate use of force. And make no mistake, hacking back is using force. And in my view, hacking back takes the lid off Pandora's box if we were to allow companies to hack back. That is, allow individuals or private organizations to fight back against cyber adversaries who are penetrating their networks. Okay, first it's illegal. Great. That's interesting, but maybe not all that relevant, right? Because laws do change. It used to be illegal to drink a beer in this country, no matter how old you were, and it was perfectly legal to send kids down into coal mines, right? So laws change. But hacking back is also incredibly stupid, and it's stupid because if you're going to pick a fight or engage in a fight with somebody, you better have escalation dominance. And I don't care if you're a Wall Street bank spending $500 million a year on security, you better ask yourself whether you have escalation dominance over the PLA, the Chinese army, or whether you have escalation dominance over the Russian intelligence service. And if the answer is no, then don't hack back, because you're going to get yourself locked in a fight you're going to lose. So there is a disturbing level of agitation, a little bit in businesses, but mainly in Congress, to change the law to allow companies to hack back. I think it is beyond disastrous and stupid, and we just shouldn't do it. More broadly, though, it's certainly the tone has changed, right? 5 years ago, the conversation, a CEO could look at his or her board and say with some conviction, we're good. We're doing everything we need to do. Or the CIO's on it, right? Nobody gets away with that conversation anymore. Not after the series of breaches that we've seen. Public company CEOs have been fired. D&O insurance policies have been invoked. Huge class action lawsuits have been filed. I think every board and management team in America that is worthy of its position knows that this is a front and center issue. It's an existential business risk issue, and it's not some exogenous thing. ought to be rolled into and dealt with in a normal enterprise risk management framework. Like, this isn't anything intrinsically new. It's an existential business risk, and there are three things you can do with risk. You can accept it, and some risk you probably do want to just accept, otherwise you go crazy and broke throwing money at a problem that you're not going to solve. Some risk you'll transfer via insurance, and some risk you'll choose to mitigate. And you'll mitigate it via people, process, and tech.
So are there CEOs out there that are chomping at the bit to hack back?
Yes, sure, there are. It's like anything. There are two in every crowd, right? So yes, there are.
Okay. And back to the original question on businesses. You don't get this as a journalist. I don't get the raw feelings from these executives on what it feels like to be hacked by a nation state, or the fact they now have to defend themselves against tools that were leaked from the NSA and now being used back against them. So let me just break that down a little bit. Last April, a group called the Shadow Brokers, we just wrote about them in the New York Times. They're this mystery group. We have no idea who they are. We think they might be a agency insider mole type working perhaps with Russia, maybe not. It's very nebulous, and we actually really have no idea who these people are. Have been leaking some of the NSA's cyber attack tools online. So last April, they dumped about a dozen tools, and those tools basically took advantage of software vulnerabilities in Microsoft products, in firewalls made by Oracle and others. I see some of you nodding, which is good, because I'm glad you've been tracking this, because to me it's one of the most undercovered topics of this cycle. But these tools are now out there, and they have been used by, I mentioned earlier, North Korea and Russia against targets that include FedEx, that include hospitals in Pennsylvania and in England. And FedEx just said they reported losses of $300 million from their second quarter because of this attack. So now we've reached this new chapter where businesses it's not just that they have to worry about Chinese intellectual property theft or Russian information warfare. They actually have to worry about the NSA's own tools coming back to paralyze their production systems. And they have to worry about basically potentially reporting hundreds of millions of dollars in losses because their own government wasn't able to protect its top cyber weapons. And that's something I'm very curious to know what some of your clients have said about this. Is this an extremely frustrating experience? Do some of them feel so patriotic that they're sort of able to rationalize this somehow?
So I had one customer say to me, he said, it's as if the CIA gave Stinger missiles to the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, and some of them were used to shoot down American airline jets. Right? It's a pretty good, it's a good analogy. It's a good analogy. So there's clearly frustration, clearly an awareness that this is a whole new world. And again, the law and the policy haven't caught up with the tech. I don't think there's no unified sense that I've heard of what to do about it. So I'll recommend two pieces of reading. The first is the piece Nicole just referenced. That was on the front page this week. This Shadow Brokers piece that she wrote for the New York Times. If you want a great, distilled version of what happened there with this leak of NSA tools, or compromise of NSA tools. The second is a piece that was posted on the White House website today. I'm not in the habit of checking the White House website on a daily basis, but Rob Joyce, who's the cybersecurity coordinator in the White House, a longtime senior exec at NSA, wrote what I thought was a very thoughtful piece about the vulnerability equities process. Probably, I don't know, a couple thousand words on the White House website. I was really surprised to see it, and I thought it was very good. And I think it begins to kind of, together, they begin to illuminate all the complexity here. And it certainly makes clear that we need to do things differently, and we need to have a, it's probably a national conversation type of issue.
So the vulnerability equities process, let me just break that down for a second.
Yeah.
I actually included it in this article that was on the front page of the New York Times, and it got completely crossed out by my editors. So the vulnerability equities process is jargon that basically is this process that was started about 8 years ago at the White House by the then cybersecurity coordinator, Howard Schmidt. And it was this idea that if the NSA and the CIA and some of these other agencies are going to go out and look for vulnerabilities in widely used products like Microsoft Windows, that we should at least be having to use for espionage or to drop a cyber weapon one day. We should at least be putting in place some sort of decision-making process that involves representatives from some of these big federal agencies like the Department of Transportation or the Treasury Department, to at least have some discussion about, okay, if we're going to hoard this particular vulnerability in Microsoft software that could be used against our rail systems one day, let's have a conversation about whether it's worth it to hold on to that or whether we should disclose it so it gets patched so it can never be used against our rail systems. And this is a process that's been a closed-door process at the White House for the last 8 years. And when I've talked to some of the people that run this process, they say that actually these discussions are there's a lot of back and forth, there's a lot of tug of war, and in some cases, the former White House cybersecurity coordinator, Michael Daniel, told me there's been blood left on the table. I have no idea what that means, but I think it means that people who thought that vulnerabilities should be disclosed and to get patched weren't disclosed because the intelligence value of some of these software vulnerabilities was too great to disclose them. So there is a process in place, but the critics say that it's a joke, that these are people who are not necessarily equipped maybe to have some of these conversations, that the more we connect more and more of our lives to the internet, the greater the risk becomes over time. So if we hoard a Microsoft vulnerability now, 2 years ago, it could be connected to a polling place or to a hospital, and we have no way of predicting that. So I don't know what Rob Joyce said today. I need to go read it, but that's what the vulnerability equities process is.
So I think historically it was viewed as kind of a rubber stamp and offense always won, right? I'm not sure that's the case anymore. It seems perhaps a little bit more even-handed, and it's not even I don't see it as a national security versus privacy or it's not that dichotomy. It's almost a debate between two national security goods, right? There is a national security good in having the ability to attack our adversaries. That's a national security good. I want the United States to be better at that than the Chinese and the Russians. There's a competing national security good in having a robust, good, patched defense, right? So, I guess as in most things in life, there's a lot of room for human judgment.
Okay, we're moving on to audience questions. These are very good. Okay, so here's one. As we enter the Internet of Things era, how can the risks and new risks be addressed? Proactively, reactively, how do we prepare for the Internet of Things era? Nate, please solve all the world problems with this next answer.
I have a tape deck in my car.
Do you have Alexa?
Literally.
Do you use Alexa?
God, my wife and daughters have Alexa, and they wonder why I don't talk at home.
Oh my God.
Yeah, we have Alexa, but We have an always-on recording device in our home by choice.
And is that the way Endgame is moving to protect against threats to your Google Home product or your Alexa product?
I mean, this is really, this is the frontier right here. You know, we're moving into a world where increasingly every device in our homes, from our cars to our refrigerators, you know, has a microprocessor, has a computer in it, and communicates with the internet. And so, I mean, your point about the Chinese menu is such a beautiful example, and that's, you know, increasingly going to be true of every corner case kind of connected thing in our homes. It becomes a vector to our crown jewels, and that's you know, that's the world that we are all choosing to live in. Not all, but many of us are choosing to live in, and it's a trade-off, right? It's a conscious choice. We're making a trade between convenience and security, and we just need to be acutely aware of the fact that that's the trade we're making. The problem is it becomes harder and harder not to make the trade. You know, I'm going to have a hard time buying my next car and having it be an analog car.
There's, when my husband wanted us to switch to Nest systems, there's a story I told him which was about the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which is a lobbying firm, had been doing a lot of lobbying against any kind of cybersecurity regulation, and they were really leading the charge and were pretty successful at it. And at the very same time they were leading this lobbying effort, they were breached by a Chinese hacking group. And the FBI came in and they did a clean sweep of their systems, and they thought they'd tracked everything down. And then 6 months later, their printer started printing out documents that had reams of Chinese characters, and their corporate apartment in DC, someone staying in it was complaining about erratic temperature changes. And when they went to investigate this issue, they found the thermometer in the corporate apartment was communicating with a Chinese IP address. So that's why I won't have Nest in my home, you know. Anyway, keep that in mind with the Chinese takeout menu.
Can I one coda to that? A kind of running joke at Endgame is what's the difference between email and true love? Email lasts forever.
I love that. Okay, here's a good one. All right. In terms of cyber defense material and practice, we still seem to be at the level of sending unarmored Humvees to Afghanistan, which is in your wheelhouse. What type of attack or event will it take for us to take the first basic step of moving to more secure and reliable operating systems, programming languages, and other systems?
So I think that's a fascinating question because we're asking it, right? I mean, it's like we're looking for the proverbial canary in the coal mine, and meanwhile, we're up to our necks in dead birds, right? We're surrounded by these examples that you would think were the watershed moment. And yet, none of them has been. And so I've pretty consistently downplayed the idea of a cyber 9/11 or a cyber Pearl Harbor. I think it's kind of an alarmist paradigm, and I think the real risk is greater than that. It's not something that is just going to hit us square between the eyes one day. It's the creeping, you know, insidious undermining of trust that slowly begins to erode our confidence in the connected world, where you know you go to refinance your mortgage, and all of a sudden that credit score that spits out, well, is it right, or is it 20 points off, right? You know, I look at my bank balance and I trust that that's actually my bank balance, but is it really? You know, that's sort of creeping. That I think is even more dangerous. And yet we've lived in that world now for at least half a decade, and we're still looking for the wake-up call. So maybe it will take something to hit us square between the eyes. And you know, what is that, or what could that be? Look, DHS. There was a great story recently, publicly reported, of DHS buying a commercial airliner in order to see how they could control the systems. You know, I actually no longer think it's crazy and alarmist to say maybe it will be the remote control of an airliner full of people and flying it into the ground, or something like that that is just so horrifying, that has such TV, made for TV quality, that it gets our attention. I think one of the best and most interesting thinkers in this space is a guy named Walter Parks. Walter's a writer and producer in Hollywood, and he did sneakers and he did war games. And he was on my last board, and I loved having conversations with him because he was such an interesting thinker. And what was amazing about him is he's a storyteller. He's a filmmaker. And so his stock in trade is to build narrative. And one of the hard things about the cybersecurity world, I think, is it's so amorphous. It's hard to stick a narrative to it, right? And so maybe we need the bad thing with the visual narrative to really get our attention. I hope not.
Okay, sorry, I'm not caught up. Okay, Nate and Nicole, who do you think hacked Equifax?
Nicole, who do you think hacked Equifax?
I don't know. I'm trying to find out. I'll let you know when I find out. Pages of the New York Times.
Yeah, I have no idea. I would just, maybe generalize that a little bit and say that I think this was, you may have reported on this, Nicole. I think this was reported on. Shortly after the OPM breach was the Ashley Madison hack of the cheaters website online, and married people looking for flings. And so you have 1 week the compromise of the personal information of everybody who has a security clearance in the US, and within a couple of weeks, the compromise of all the people using this online service, and then the two data sets were cross-correlated, and all of a sudden you have a really interesting list, right, of all the people with security clearances who arguably have this point of leverage to use on them. And I think it really drives home the point that, it's easy to dismiss a lot of this stuff as spy novel fiction, but it's not. If whatever devious, crazy, mind-bending thought that we can conjure up, I can almost guarantee you Chinese and Russian and Iranian and North Korean and other intelligence services are all over it, and ours too, right? So who would want access to all of that data? Mm-hmm. It's a long list.
Yep. And when you talk to people who've been tracking the Chinese IP thefts, they'll tell you, well, actually, the intellectual property theft, industrial espionage attacks are down since the Xi-Obama agreement to sort of cease this stuff. But Chinese attacks on databases of personal information are way up because that's still considered fair game in the world of espionage. So what you were just describing with the Ashley Madison post-OPM breach, it's like big data analysis first for cybersecurity breaches.
Right. Now, one point on that, though, as individual consumers, I'll take the maybe contentious position that I actually don't really care if the Chinese army has all my data. It doesn't bother me. They're not going to steal my credit card. They want to have leverage over me if I'm ever in a position of public responsibility, but my job is to live a life that doesn't give them that leverage. I'm much more concerned. I would much prefer to have the Chinese hack my PII than some Eastern European criminal syndicate that's actually going to then require me to go get all new credit cards.
Okay. All right. Russia recently provided North Korea with an internet connection. What is your analysis of this? I thought that was actually pretty interesting and a big undercovered event.
Yeah. Well, I guess I look at it through a geopolitical lens. You can look at that two ways. On the one hand, the Russians are not our allies and are enabling our adversaries in every way that we can imagine and not imagine. But with that pipe comes opportunity for us. So, I would imagine it's a topic of great interest in the U.S. intelligence community.
Okay. Second question, your opinion on the NYT's report on deteriorating morale at NSA, which I wrote. So I'll answer that one. This is really interesting. And we did this report on the shadow brokers leaks at the NSA, and basically, the fact that we don't know who did this means that there are several investigations underway at the intelligence agencies where people who have devoted their life to working at the NSA and devoted their life to this mission are being brought in for polygraphs and being questioned. And there are people who are considered lifers and graybeards at the NSA who've been reaching out to some of the people, I'm sure you know, here in the Valley who've started cybersecurity firms for jobs. I mean, that's huge. We already have a shortage of cyber warriors in this country. And the fact that this leak has created such a big morale problem at the NSA to the point that people are now leaving. And in some of my conversations with some of these people who have left because of this, they've said, you know, basically what happened post-Snowden that people don't realize is how much red tape we have to deal with and what a burden it is to have everything you do at work every day be classified, and sort of the bureaucratic obstacles that some of these people at the NSA face. So they said layer on top of that the fact that you get dragged in for polygraphs and that all your programs are audited and that programs you've worked on for 10 years have to be shut down because one vulnerability that you relied on for these espionage programs was dumped online by the shadow brokers, and now that whole program has to be shut down. And that's amazing. I mean, that is not a fun place to work. And they don't get paid enough to want to stay when they can make twice as much at Google or at some of the cybersecurity startups within 20 miles of us right now. So I don't know what my opinion of it is, other than I think that the leaks have created a real mess. And I think that people have realized that, you know, we've spent so much, to your point, money and effort and resources on offense without putting the same effort towards defense. And now that has finally caught up to us. So that's my take.
Can I add something to that? Yeah. And I agree with every word of that. I think this country learned a lesson after Vietnam to draw a distinction between the policymakers and the people implementing the policy. And I'm grateful, as a veteran of the post-9/11 wars, that people seem to recognize that distinction today and can criticize the policy without personally attacking the people who implemented it. And I think we need to make sure that we remember that with the intelligence community too. And the people who work at NSA and CIA, I would argue, and other agencies, I would argue that we as citizens benefit hugely from having those institutions robust and representative and filled with smart people. And we need to be really careful that our criticisms of the policy don't extend to the people who are implementing it. And and I think there have been examples of significant government overreach especially since 9/11. But these aren't NSA or CIA employees freelancing. They are executing the orders of a government under the oversight of congressional committees. And if we have a problem with that, then we should target our criticism at the laws and the elected representatives and be very mindful of the fact that none of us is well served if all the great talent drains from places like the NSA.
Okay, this is a good one. What is the cyber equivalent of MAD, mutually assured destruction?
Yeah, that's an interesting deterrence question. So mutual assured destruction, obviously the deterrent notion that you retain a robust enough second strike capability that if somebody hits you first, you can hit them back and ensure their destruction. And the theory being that kind of robust and survivable second strike is kind of the bedrock of the nuclear peace. What is its equivalent in the cyber domain? It's an interesting question. I'm not sure I have a great answer to it. I think it's MAD. I think it's, you know, I'm sorry, I'm thinking in real time through this. I think it gets back to the point that we need to think about decoupling cyber attack cyber response and think about a cyber attack as a tactic. And our response could be via cyber means, or it could be via, it could be diplomatic, it could be economic, it could be informational, it could be military. And we need to be willing to go up that escalatory ladder and use all the instruments of national power in order to deter the nefarious cyber acts. So MAD in the cyber domain is the same thing as MAD in the nuclear domain if we're really talking about making deterrence work.
And I think, if you add up all the attacks I've covered over the last couple of years, there's been so many Russian attacks on U.S. oil and energy firms. There has recently, I just wrote about a Russian attack on nuclear facilities. They weren't able to get into the production systems or the operation systems, but they were successful in getting into the business networks of some of these nuclear power plants, and clearly were probing to see how far they could get. We know that there's been Chinese attacks on companies that provide the software for a lot of our oil and gas pipelines. And I think we'd be remiss not to assume the U.S. is engaged in some of those very same activities with our adversaries. So I've sort of come to this point that in cyber, we actually are just at this détente, almost like a nuclear détente, where if we were to do something, we know that the adversary is just as deeply embedded in some of our oil and gas pipelines and energy firms as we are in theirs. So if you're going to be the first to pull the trigger, you should expect that some of those same activities will happen on your own soil. Okay, here's a good one to bring us full circle. Which classical thinker has the most to teach us about waging and winning cyber war?
Ooh, wow. I like that question.
That's the last question, by the way.
Unfortunately, I think I already gave my answer, which is St. Augustine. I think we need to go back to the roots of just war theory and recognize that that human conflict doesn't really change. Thucydides in the Melian dialogue famously says, "The strong do what they can, and the weak do what they must." And I think that is part of the human condition, and part of living in a civilized society, in my view, is that the government retains a monopoly on the legitimate use of force, and we have norms governing that use of force. And they're built around these pillars of proportionality and non-combatant immunity. And just because we have a new set of tools at our disposal doesn't mean that the rules of the road go out the window. We need to think long and hard about how to use or not use those tools in accordance with these time-honored norms.
All right, thank you so much, Nate, and thank you so much, everyone, for coming. I didn't expect to see this audience so full, so it's really great to have you here and to read some of your very thoughtful questions. So thank you.
Thank you all. Thanks, Nicole.